In the summer of 1942, the world had been gripped in the turmoil of the Second World War for nearly 3 years. Among the vast landscapes of Eastern Europe, one city on the banks of the Volga River became the focal point of a brutal and unrelenting struggle. The city was Stalingrad. It was not only a key industrial hub, but also bore the name of the Soviet leader himself, Joseph Stalin, making it a symbolic target for Adolf Hitler. What began as a strategic operation quickly spiraled into one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The Battle of Stalingrad would come to symbolize the turning tide of the war, as the German advance into Soviet territory was met with fierce resistance and eventual reversal. The story of Stalingrad did not begin with gunfire and bloodshed. It began with ambition and calculation. Operation Barbarossa, launched by Germany in June of 1941, aimed to crush the Soviet Union in a matter of months. The German war machine tore through vast stretches of land with incredible speed. Cities fell, and the Red Army was forced into retreat after retreat. But as the winter set in and the Germans found themselves unprepared for the bitter Russian cold, the tide began to slow. By the time spring returned, Hitler turned his focus southward, aiming to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus. For this, Stalingrad needed to fall. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, was tasked with the assault on Stalingrad. With around 250,000 men, they began their push toward the city in the summer of 1942. Initial progress was swift. The Luftwaffe, commanded by Wolfram von Richthofen, launched devastating air raids on Stalingrad in August, reducing much of the city to rubble. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed or wounded in these early days. Soviet leadership had been slow to evacuate the city, hoping to maintain morale and demonstrate defiance. What remained of the civilian population was now trapped in a landscape of ruins, caught between the opposing forces. As German forces entered the outskirts of Stalingrad, they expected a relatively quick victory. What they found was a Soviet defense that was both desperate and unyielding. Stalin had issued Order Number 227, not one step back, demanding that no ground be given without a fight. Troops were executed for retreating. Penal battalions were formed from prisoners and political undesirables, sent to the most dangerous fronts as expendable soldiers. Soviet General Vasily Chuikov, who would later become a key figure in the defense, assumed command of the 62nd Army and prepared for a brutal urban fight. The Germans were trained and equipped for swift, open-field battles. What they faced in Stalingrad was house-to-house fighting among the ruins of a destroyed city. Snipers like the famed Vasily Zaitsev turned every window and basement into a potential trap. Buildings were defended floor by floor, sometimes with Germans on one level and Soviets on another. Entire factories became battlegrounds. The Red October steel plant, the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, and the Barricadi ordnance factory were scenes of vicious combat, where men fought with rifles, grenades, and even bayonets in the choking dust and smoke. The Germans dubbed this type of warfare Rattenkrieg, or Rat War, for it resembled the savage and confined fights between desperate animals. Morale among the soldiers began to erode as the weeks dragged on. Supplies were limited, and the cold began to creep back in as the calendar turned toward autumn. Yet Hitler remained obsessed with capturing the city. He saw it as a test of German strength and Soviet resolve. He ignored the advice of his generals, demanding more troops be poured into the grinder. Entire divisions were rotated through the meat of the battle, and casualties mounted with no end in sight. Meanwhile, the Soviets were quietly preparing a trap. Under the guidance of generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, a massive counteroffensive was being formed. Operation Uranus, as it was called, was not aimed directly at the German forces in the city, but at their flanks, held by weaker Romanian and Hungarian units. These troops were poorly equipped and had little training compared to the Wehrmacht. Soviet forces amassed in secret, bringing tanks, artillery, and infantry from across the country. The plan was bold: to encircle the entire German Sixth Army and cut it off from resupply and escape. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet hammer fell. In freezing temperatures, Soviet tanks and infantry launched their assault north and south of Stalingrad. The Romanian forces buckled quickly. Within days, the encirclement was complete. The German Sixth Army was trapped. Attempts to break them out failed. Luftwaffe airlifts were inadequate and suffered heavy losses. Hitler refused to allow Paulus to retreat, insisting that the army could hold out and would be relieved. But relief never came. Inside the pocket, known as the Kessel or cauldron, conditions rapidly deteriorated. Starvation set in. Ammunition ran low. Thousands of wounded soldiers lay in makeshift hospitals, often without proper medical care. The winter deepened. Temperatures dropped to unbearable lows. Frostbite, disease, and despair claimed lives even when bullets did not. Still, the order was to hold. In the final weeks of the battle, Soviet troops closed in relentlessly. Street by street, they took back what had been lost. The Germans were forced into smaller and smaller pockets of resistance. Communications began to break down. On January 31st, 1943, General Paulus, now promoted to field marshal in a failed effort to ensure he would fight to the death, surrendered. He became the first German field marshal to be captured alive. A few days later, the last remnants of the Sixth Army laid down their arms. Of the over 250,000 soldiers who entered the battle, fewer than 100,000 were taken prisoner, and of those, only around 5,000 would ever return to Germany. The rest perished from wounds, starvation, disease, or execution. The Soviet casualties were staggering as well, with estimates ranging from 750,000 to over 1 million dead, wounded, or missing. The civilian population of Stalingrad, once numbering over 400,000, was virtually eradicated. The victory at Stalingrad was not just a military success, it was a turning point in the war. The myth of German invincibility had been shattered. The Soviet Union seized the initiative and would never relinquish it. From that winter on, the Red Army began its push westward, eventually reaching Berlin in 1945. But for those who fought in Stalingrad, the scars remained forever. The aftermath of the Battle of Stalingrad left the once thriving city in utter ruin. The snow-covered rubble bore silent witness to the horror and devastation of 6 months of unrelenting combat. The shattered buildings were littered with the remains of both German and Soviet soldiers, and the stillness in the air was broken only by the moans of the wounded and the cries of survivors searching for loved ones. The frozen corpses were sometimes buried in the ruins where they fell, others hastily covered in the snow. The stench of death would linger long after the last shots were fired. Despite the enormous loss of life and infrastructure, the Soviet leadership wasted no time in turning the symbolic victory into a national rallying cry. Soviet propaganda praised the courage and heroism of the defenders, while Stalin himself proclaimed that the German army had been broken by the sheer will of the Red Soldier. Ceremonies were held to honor the fallen, medals awarded, and stories of bravery were spread through newspapers and broadcasts to inspire the rest of the nation. For many, the battle had not just been about defending a city, but defending the soul of the Soviet Union itself. In Germany, the defeat was a shock to the national psyche. For the first time, the propaganda machine could not cover the extent of the disaster. Families across the Reich received notices that their sons, fathers, and brothers were missing, wounded, or dead. Hitler, humiliated by the failure, blamed his generals and purged those he believed responsible. The trust between the Führer and his military high command was fractured. Though he had declared that the German army would never surrender, the reality of Paulus's capitulation shattered that illusion. It marked the beginning of the erosion of Hitler's control over military strategy, though he would cling to it more desperately in the years to come. The tide of the war had turned. While the German army still held vast territories across Europe, North Africa, and the Soviet Union, their momentum had been broken. The Soviet Union, once on the brink of collapse, now had hope and a firm footing. Factories deep in the east continued churning out tanks, planes, and weapons, and fresh divisions were raised to capitalize on the momentum. Stalin, emboldened by the victory, pressed his generals to plan for further offensives. He knew that to ensure the survival of the USSR, they had to push the Germans out of their lands entirely. The Red Army's push began in earnest in 1943. Operation Little Saturn, a follow-up to the Stalingrad encirclement, targeted Italian forces on the Don River, resulting in another crushing defeat for the Axis. The German lines began to buckle, and by the summer, the Soviets were advancing across a broad front. Towns and villages long under German control were liberated, often revealing atrocities committed during the occupation. The morale of Soviet soldiers was mixed with a deep desire for revenge. What they found in these places only fueled their determination. Among the ruins of Stalingrad, efforts to rebuild began almost immediately. Engineers and workers returned, even as the ground was still frozen and littered with unexploded ordnance. The city's reconstruction became a symbol of Soviet resilience. Temporary shelters were set up for the few surviving civilians, and brick by brick, Stalingrad began to rise from the ashes. It would take years to rebuild, but the city's very survival stood as a testament to the Soviet people's refusal to yield. On the German side, Hitler's insistence on holding territory at all costs would prove disastrous. Instead of retreating to more defensible positions, German troops were ordered to dig in. This led to a series of grueling battles throughout 1943 and 1944, culminating in massive Soviet offensives that would drive the Germans out of Soviet territory entirely. The Wehrmacht, once feared and invincible, was now on the defensive. The myth of German superiority had died on the banks of the Volga. As the war dragged into its final years, the memory of Stalingrad remained fresh in the minds of soldiers and civilians alike. For the Red Army, it became a source of strength. For the Germans, a haunting reminder of the consequences of overreach and the cruelty of blind obedience. Veterans who survived the battle carried the psychological weight for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress, their memories haunted by the sights, sounds, and smells of that frozen city of death. The international community also took notice. Allied leaders in Britain and the United States saw the Soviet victory as a critical shift in the balance of power. Though they were cautious in their praise, wary of Stalin's ambitions, they understood that the Eastern Front was now the key to defeating Nazi Germany. Supplies and aid to the USSR increased, and plans for a second front in Western Europe began to take shape. The eventual Normandy invasion in 1944 was influenced in part by the recognition of the massive sacrifices made by the Soviets. In the post-war years, Stalingrad was honored with the title of Hero City, and monuments were erected to commemorate the battle. The most famous among them, the Motherland Calls, stands tall with sword in hand, symbolizing the strength and sacrifice of those who fought. The Volgograd State Panorama Museum was established to preserve the memory of the battle, featuring artifacts, documents, and personal accounts. Visitors to the city could see the trenches, bunkers, and ruined factories where history had been made. The landscape, once scorched by war, slowly greened with the passing of time, though the echoes of the past were never far. Yet the legacy of the Battle of Stalingrad is not simply one of victory. It is a reminder of the terrible cost of war, of the millions who suffered, and the choices that led humanity to such depths. It is a lesson in resilience and resistance, but also in hubris and the dangers of unchecked power. The names and faces of those who fought may fade, but their stories continue to be told, year after year, in classrooms, museums, and homes across the world. For the historians who study the battle, the complexity is staggering. It was not simply a clash of armies, but a convergence of ideologies, cultures, and human experiences. The diaries of soldiers reveal despair and moments of humanity amid the horror. Letters home speak of longing, fear, and duty. The sheer scale of the battle, millions engaged, hundreds of thousands dead, boggles the mind. Yet it was in that crucible that the fate of the world shifted. Stalingrad showed that even in the darkest hour, when the enemy was at the gates and hope seemed lost, determination and unity could change the course of history. The battle became more than a military engagement. It became a symbol of resistance against tyranny, a testament to what people can endure and overcome. Thank you for joining us in the Battle of Stalingrad. Hope you enjoyed. Sleep well. Suggested YouTube title, The Battle of Stalingrad, Obahu's